Ingersoll's lecture on Which Way. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ingersoll's lecture on Which Way, from the collection Lectures of Colonel Robert Green Ingersoll. Ladies and gentlemen, for thousands of years men have been asking the questions: how shall we civilize the world? How shall we protect life, liberty, property, and reputations? How shall we do away with crime and poverty? How clothe and feed and educate and civilize mankind? These are the questions that are asked by thoughtful men and thoughtful women. The question with them is not, what will we do in some other world? Time enough to ask that when we get there. The business we will attend to now is, how are we to civilize the world? What priest shall I ask? What sacred volume shall I search? What oracle can I consult? At what shrine must I bow to find out what is to be done? Each church has a different answer. Each has a different recipe for the salvation of the people, but not while they are in this world. All that is to be done in this world is to get ready for the next. In the first place, I am met by the theological world. Have I the right to inquire? They say, certainly, it is your duty to inquire. Each church has a recipe for the salvation of this world, but not while you are in this world. Afterward. They treat time as a kind of pier, a kind of wharf running out into the great ocean of eternity. And they treat us all as though we were waiting there, sitting on our trunks for the gospel ship. I want to know what to do here. Have I the right to inquire? Yes. If I have the right to inquire, then I have the right to investigate. If I have the right to investigate, I have the right to accept. If I have the right to accept, I have the right to reject. And what religion have I the right to reject? That which does not conform with my reason, with my standard of truth, and my standard of common sense. Millions of men have been endeavoring to govern this world by means of the supernatural. Thousands and thousands of churches exist. Thousands of cathedrals and temples have been built. Millions of men have been engaged to preach this gospel. And what has been the result in this world? Will one church have any sympathy with another? Does the religion of one country have any respect for that of another? Or does not each religion claim to be the only one? And does not the priest of every religion, with infinite impudence, consign the disciples of all others to eternal fire? Why is it the churches have failed to civilize this world? Why is it that the Christian countries are no better than any other countries? Why is it that Christian men are no better than any other men? Why is it that ministers, as a class, are no better than doctors or lawyers or merchants or mechanics or locomotive engineers? And a locomotive engineer is 1,000 times more useful. Give me a good engineer and a bad preacher to go through this world with, rather than a bad engineer and a good preacher. And there is this curious fact about the believers in the supernatural. The priests of one church have no confidence in the miracles and wonders told by the priests of the other churches. Maybe they know each other. A Christian missionary will tell the Hindu of the miracles in the Bible. The Hindu smiles. The Hindu tells the Christian missionary of the miracles of his sacred books, and the missionary looks upon him with pity and contempt. No priest takes the word of another. I heard once a little story that illustrates this point. A gentleman in a little party was telling of a most wonderful occurrence, and when he had finished everybody said, "Is it possible? Why, did you ever hear anything like that?" All united in a kind of wondering chorus, except one man. He said nothing. He was perfectly still and unmoved. And one who had been greatly astonished by the story said to him, "Did you hear that story?" "Yes." "Well, you don't appear to be excited." Well, no, he said. I am a liar myself. There is another trouble with the supernatural. It has no honesty. It is consumed by egotism. It does not think, it knows. Consequently, it has no patience with the honest doubter. And how has the church treated the honest doubter? He has been answered by force, by authority, by popes, by cardinals and bishops and councils, and, above all, by mobs. In that way the honest doubter has been answered. There is this difference between the minister, the church, the clergy, and the men who believe in this world. I might as well state the question. I may go further than you. The real question is this: are we to be governed by a supernatural being, or are we to govern ourselves? That is the question. Is God the source of power, or does all authority spring, in governing, from the consent of the governed? That is the question. In other words, is the universe a monarchy, a despotism, or a democracy? I take the democratic side, not in a political sense. The question is whether this world should be governed by God or by man. And when I say God, I mean the being that these gentlemen have treated and enthroned upon the ignorance of mankind. Now let us admit, for the sake of argument, that the Bible is true. Let us admit, for the sake of argument, that God once governed this world. Not that he did, but let us admit it. And I intend to speak of no God but our God, because we all insist that of all the gods ours is the best, and if he is not good we need not trouble ourselves about the others. Let them take care of themselves. Now the first question is whether this world shall be governed by God or man. Admitting that the being spoken of in the Bible is God, he governed this world once. There was a theocracy at the start. That was the first government of the world. Now, how do you judge of a man? The best test of a man is, how does he use power? That is the supreme test of manhood. How does he treat those within his control? The greater the man, the grander the man, the more careful he is in the use of power, the tenderer he is, the nearer just, the greater, the more merciful, the grander, the more charitable. Tell me how a man treats his wife or his children, his poor debtors, his servants, and I will tell you what manner of a man he be. That, I say, is the supreme test, and we know tonight how a good and great man treats his inferiors. We know that. And a man endeavoring to raise his fellow men higher in the scale of civilization, what will that man appeal to? Will he appeal to the lowest or to the highest that is in man? Let us be honest. Will he appeal to prejudice, the fortress, the armor, the sword and shield of ignorance? Will he appeal to credulity, the ring in the nose by which priests lead stupidity? Will he appeal to the cowardly man? Will he play upon his fears, fear the capital stock of imposture, the lever and fulcrum of hypocrisy? Will he appeal to the selfishness and all the slimy serpents that crawl in the den of savagery? Or will he appeal to reason, the torch of the mind? Will he appeal to justice? Will he appeal to charity, which is justice in blossom? Will he appeal to liberty and love? These are the questions. What will he do? What did our God do? Let us see. The first thing we know of him is in the Garden of Eden. How did he endeavor to make his children great and strong and good and free? Did he say anything to Adam and Eve about the sacred relation of marriage? Did he say anything to them about loving children? Did he say anything to them about learning anything under heaven? Did he say one word about intellectual liberty? Did he say one word about reason or about justice? Did he make the slightest effort to improve them? All that he did in the world was to give them one poor, little, miserable, barren command: "Thou shalt not eat of a certain fruit." That's all that amounted to anything. And when they sinned, did this great God take them in the arms of his love and endeavor to reform them? No. He simply put on them a curse. When they were expelled, he said to the woman, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children. Thy husband shall rule over thee. God made every mother a criminal, and placed a perpetual penalty of pain upon human love. Our God made wives slaves, slaves of their husbands. Our God corrupted the marriage relation and paralyzed the firesides of this world. That is what our God did. And what did he say to poor Adam? Cursed be the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field, and in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. Did he say one word calculated to make him a better man? Did he put in the horizon of the future one star of hope? Let us be honest and see what this God did, and we will judge of him simply by ordinary common sense. After a while, Cain murdered his brother, and he was detected by this God. And what did this God say to him? Did he say one word of the crime of shedding human blood? Not a word. Did he say one word calculated to excite in the breast of Cain the slightest sorrow for his deed? Not the slightest. Did he tell him anything about where Abel was? Nothing. Did he endeavor to make him a better man? Not a bit. What had he ever taught him before on that subject? Nothing. And so Cain went out to the other sons and daughters of Adam, according to the Bible, and they multiplied and increased until they covered the earth. God gave them no code of laws. God never built them a schoolhouse. God never sent a teacher. God never said a word to them about a future state. God never held up before their gaze that dazzling reward of heaven, never spoke about the lurid gulfs of hell, kept divine punishment a perfect secret, and without having given them the slightest opportunity, simply drowned the world. Splendid administration. Cleveland will do better than that. And after the waters had gone away, then he gave them some commandments. I suppose that he saw by that time that they needed guidance. And here are the commandments. 1. You may eat all kinds of birds, beasts, and fishes. 2. You must not eat blood. If you do, I will kill you. 3. Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Nothing more. No good advice, not a word about government, not a word about the rights of man or woman or children, not a word about any law of nature, not a word about any science. Nothing, not even arithmetic. Nothing. And so he let them go on, and in a little while they came to the same old state, and began building the Tower of Babel, and he went there and confounded, as they said, their languages. Never said a word to them, never told them how foolish it was to try and reach heaven that way. And the next we find him talking to Abraham, and with Abraham he makes a contract. And how did he do it? I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. Fine contract for a God. And thereupon he made certain promises to Abraham, promised to give him the whole world, all the nations round about, and that his seed should be as the sands of the sea. Never kept one of his promises, not one. He made the same promises to Isaac, and broke every one. Then he made them all over to Jacob, and broke every one. Made them again to Moses, and broke them all. Never said a word about anybody behaving themselves. Not a word. Finally, these people whom he had taken under his special care became slaves in the land of Egypt. How ashamed God must have been. Finally, he made up his mind to rescue them from that servitude, and he sent Moses and Aaron. He never said a word to Moses or Aaron that Pharaoh was wrong. He never said a word to them about how the women felt when their male children were taken and destroyed. He simply sent Moses before Pharaoh with a cane in his hand that he could turn into a serpent. And when Pharaoh called in magicians and they did the same, Pharaoh laughed. And then they made frogs, and Pharaoh sent for his magicians and they did the same, and Pharaoh still laughed. And this God had infinite power, but Pharaoh defeated him at every point. It puts me in mind of the story that great Fenian told when the great excitement was about Ireland. An Irishman was telling about the condition of Ireland. He said, "We have got in Ireland now over 300,000 soldiers, all equipped. Every man of them has got a musket and ammunition. They are ready to march at a minute's notice." "But," said the other man, "why don't they march?" "Why," said the other man, "the police won't let them." How admirable! Imagine the infinite God endeavoring to liberate the Hebrews, and prevented by a king who would not let the children of Israel go until he had done some little miracles with sticks. Think of it! "But," said Christians, "you must wait a little while if you wish to find the foundation of law." Christians now assert that from Sinai came to this world all knowledge of right and wrong, and that from its flaming top we received the first ideas of law and justice. Let us look at those 10 commandments. Which of those 10 commandments were new, and which of those 10 commandments were old? Thou shalt not kill. That was as old as life. Murder has been a crime, also because men object to being murdered. If you read the same Bible you will find that Moses, seeing an Israelite and an Egyptian contending together, smote the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. After he had committed that crime, Moses fled from the land. Why? Simply because there was a law against murder. That is all. Honor thy father and thy mother. That is as old as birth. Thou shalt not commit adultery. That is as old as sex. Thou shalt not steal. That is as old as work, and as old as property. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. That is as old as the earth. Never was there a nation, never was there a tribe on the earth that did not have substantially those commandments. What then were new? First, thou shalt worship no other God. Thou shalt have no other God. Why? Because I am a jealous God. Second, thou shalt not make any graven image. Third, thou shalt not take my name in vain. Fourth, thou shalt not work on the Sabbath day. What use were these commandments? None, not the slightest. How much better it would have been if God from Sinai, instead of the commandments, had said, "Thou shalt not enslave thy fellow man. No human being is entitled to the results of another's labor." Suppose he had said, "Thou shalt not persecute for opinion's sake. Thought and speech must be forever free." Suppose he had said, instead of "Thou shalt not work on the Sabbath day," "A man shall have but one wife, a woman shall have but one husband. Husbands shall love their wives, wives shall love their husbands and their children with all their hearts and as themselves." How much better it would have been for this world. Long before Moses was born, the Egyptians taught one God, but afterwards, I believe, in their weakness, they degenerated into a belief in the Trinity. They taught the divine origin of the soul, and taught judgment after death. They taught, as a reward for belief in their doctrine, eternal joy, and as a punishment for non-belief, eternal pain. Egypt, as a matter of fact, was far better governed than Palestine. The laws of Egypt were better than the laws of God. In Egypt, woman was equal with man. Long before Moses was born, there were queens upon the Egyptian throne. Long before Moses was born, they had a written code of laws, and their laws were administered by courts and judges. They had rules of evidence. They understood the philosophy of damages. Long before Moses was born, they had asylums for the insane and hospitals for the sick. Long before God appeared on Sinai, there were schools in Egypt, and the highest office next to the throne was opened to the successful scholar. The Egyptian married but one wife. His wife was called the lady of the house. Women were not secluded, and above all and over all, the people of Egypt were not divided into castes, and were infinitely better governed than God ever thought of. I am speaking of the God of this Bible. If Moses had remembered more of what he saw in Egypt, his government would have been far better than it was. Long before these commandments were given, Zoroaster taught the Hindus that there was one infinite and supreme God. They had a code of laws, and their laws were administered by judges in their courts. By those laws, at the death of a father, the unmarried daughter received twice as much of his property as his son. Compare those laws with the laws of Moses. So, too, the Romans had their code of laws. The Romans were the greatest lawyers the world produced. The Romans had a code of civil laws, and that code today is the foundation of all law in the civilized world. The Romans built temples to truth, to faith, to valor, to concord, to modesty, to charity, and to chastity. And so with the Grecians. And yet you will find Christian ministers today contending that all ideas of law, of justice, and of right came from Sinai, from the Ten Commandments, from the Mosaic laws. No lawyer who understands his profession will claim that is so. No lawyer who has studied the history of law will claim it. No man who knows history itself will claim it. No man will claim it but an ignorant zealot. Let us go another step. Let us compare the ideas of this God with the ideas of uninspired men. I am making this long preface because I want to get it out of your minds that the Bible is inspired. Now let us go along a little and see what is God's opinion of liberty. Nothing is of more value in this world today than liberty. Liberty of body and liberty of mind. Without liberty, the universe would be as a dungeon into which human beings are flung like poor and miserable convicts. Intellectual liberty is the air of the soul, the sunshine of the mind. Without it, we should be in darkness. Now Jehovah commanded the Jewish people to take captive the strangers and sojourners amongst them, and ordered that they and their children should be bondsmen and bondswomen forever. Now let us compare Jehovah to Epictetus, a man to whom no revelation was ever made, a man to whom this God did not appear. Let us listen to him. Remember, your servants are to be treated as your own brothers, children of the same God. On the subject of liberty, is not Epictetus a better authority than Jehovah, who told the Jews to make bondsmen and bondswomen of the heathen round about? And he said they were to make them their bondsmen and bondswomen forever. Why? Because they were heathen. Why? Because they were not children of the Jews. He was the God of the Jews and not the rest of mankind. So he said to his chosen people, pillage upon the enemy and destroy the people of other gods. Bury the heathen round about. Yet Cicero, a poor pagan lawyer, said this, and he had not even read the Old Testament, had not even had the advantage of being enlightened by the prophets. They who say that we should love our fellow citizens and not foreigners destroy the universal brotherhood of mankind, and with it benevolence and justice would perish forever. Is not Cicero greater than Jehovah? The Bible, inspired by Jehovah, says, "If a man smite his servant with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be punished. If he continue a day or two and then die, he shall not be punished." Zeno, the founder of the Stoics, who had never heard of Jehovah and never read a word of Moses, said this: "No man can be the owner of another." And the title is bad. Whether the slave became a slave by conquest or by purchase, the title is bad. Let us come and see whether Jehovah has any humanity in him. Jehovah ordered the Jewish general to make war, and this was the order: "And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them." And yet Epictetus, whom I have already quoted, said, "Treat those in thy power as thou wouldst have thy superiors treat thee." I am on the side of the pagan. Is it possible that a being of infinite goodness said, "I will heap mischief upon them, I will send my arrows upon them. They shall be burned with hunger, they shall be devoured with burning heat and with bitter destruction. I will also send the teeth of locusts upon them, with the poisonous serpent of the desert. The sound without and the terror within shall destroy both the young men and the virgins, the sucklings also, and the men with gray hairs." While Seneca, a poor, uninspired Roman, said, "A wise man will not pardon any crime that ought to be punished, but will accomplish in other way all that is sought. He will spare some, he will pardon and watch over some because of their youth. He will pardon these on account of their ignorance. His clemency will not fail what is sought by justice, but his clemency will fulfill justice." That was said by Seneca. Can we believe that this Jehovah said, "Let his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. Let his children be continually vagabonds and beg. Let them seek their bread out of desolate places. Let the extortioner catch all that he hath, and let the stranger spoil his labor. Let no one extend mercy unto them, neither let any favor his fatherless children." Did Jehovah say this? Surely he had never heard this line, this plaintive music from the Hindu. Sweet is the lute to those who have not heard the voices of their own children. Let us see the generosity of Jehovah out of the cloud of darkness on Mount Sinai. He said to the Jews, "Thou shalt have no other God before me. Thou shalt not bow down to any other gods. For the Lord thy God is a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of them that hate me." Just think of God saying to people, "If you do not love me, I will damn you." Contrast this with the words put by the Hindu poet into the mouth of Brahma: "I am the same to all mankind. They who honestly worship other gods involuntarily worship me. I am he that partaketh of all worship. I am the reward of worship." How perfectly sublime! Let me read it to you again. "I am the same to all mankind. They who honestly worship other gods involuntarily worship me. I am he that partaketh of all worship. I am the reward of worship." Compare these passages. The first is a dungeon which crude hands have digged with jealous slime. The other is like the dome of the firmament inlaid with constellations. Is it possible God ever said, "If a prophet deceive when he hath spoken a thing, I, the Lord, hath deceived that prophet"? Compare that passage with the poet, a pagan. Better remain silent the remainder of life than speak falsely. Can we believe a being of infinite mercy gave this command: Put every man his sword by his side, go from the gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. Consecrate it yourselves this day. Let every man lay his sword even upon his son, upon his brother, that he bestow blessing upon me this day. Surely that was not the outcome of a great, magnanimous spirit, like that of the Roman emperor, who declared, I had rather keep a single Roman citizen alive than slay 1,000 enemies. Compare the last command given to the children of Israel with the words of Marcus Aurelius: I have formed an idea of the state in which there is the same law for all, and equal rights and equal liberty of speech established for all; an empire where nothing is honored so much as the freedom of the citizens. I am on the side of the Roman emperor. What is more beautiful than the old story from Sufi? There was a man who for 7 years did every act of good, every kind of charity, and at the end of the 7 years he mounted the steps to the gate of heaven and knocked. A voice cried, Who is there? He cried, Thy servant, O Lord, and the gates were shut. 7 other years he did every good work, and again mounted the steps to heaven and knocked. The voice cried, Who is there? He answered, Thy slave, O God, and the gates were shut. 7 other years he did every good deed, and again mounted the steps to heaven, and the voice said, Who is there? He replied, Thyself, O God, and the gates wide open flew. Is there anything in our religion so warm or so beautiful as that? Compare that story from a pagan with the Presbyterian religion. Take this story of Indesthora, who was a king of Egypt, and started for the place where the horizon touched the earth, where he was to meet God. With him followed Argun and Bemis and Traubation. They were taught that when any man started after God in that way, if he had been guilty of any crime, he would fall by the way. Indesthora walked at the head, and suddenly he missed Arjun. He said, he was not always merciful in the hour of victory. A little while after he missed Bemis, and said, he fought not so much for the rights of man as for his own glory. A little farther on he missed Traubation. He said, my God, I know no reason for his failing to reach the place where the horizon touches the earth. And the god Ram appeared to him, and opening the curtains of the sky, said to him, Enter. And Indesthora said, But where are my brethren? Where are Arjun and Benis and Traubation? And the god said, They sinned in their time, and they are condemned to suffer below. Then said Indesthora, I do not wish to enter into your heaven without my friends. If they are below, then I will join them. But the god said, They are here before you. I simply said this to try your soul. Indesthora simply turned and said, But what of my dog? The god said, Thou knowest that if the shadow of a dog fall upon the sacrifice, it is unclean. How then can a dog enter heaven? And Indesthora replies, I know that, and I know another thing, that ingratitude is the blackest of crimes, whether it be to man or beast. That dog has been my faithful friend. He has followed me, and I will not desert even him. And the god said, Let the dog follow. Compare that with the Bible stories. Long before the advent of Christ, Aristotle said, we should conduct ourselves towards others as we would have them conduct themselves toward us. Seneca said, do not to your neighbor what you would not have your neighbor do to you. Socrates said, act toward others as you would have others act toward you. Forgive your enemies, render good for evil, and kiss even the hand that is upraised to smite. Krishna said, cease to do evil, aim to do well, love your enemies. It is the law of love that virtue is the only thing that has strength. Poor, miserable pagans! Did you ever hear anything like this? Is it possible that one of the authors of the New Testament was inspired when he said that man was not created for woman, but woman for man? Epictetus said, "What is more delightful than to be so dear to your wife as to be on her account dearer even to yourself?" Compare that with St. Paul. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord. That was inspiration. This was written by a poor, despised heathen. In whatever house the husband is contented with the wife, and the wife with the husband, in that house will fortune dwell. In the house where the woman is not honored, let the curse be pronounced. Where the wife is honored, there God is truly worshiped. I wish Jehovah had said something like that from Sinai. Is there anything as beautiful as this in the New Testament? Shall I tell you where nature is more blessed and fair? It is where those we love abide. Though the space be small, it is ample as earth. Though it be a desert, through it run the rivers of paradise. Compare these things with the curses pronounced in the Old Testament, where you read of the heathen being given over to butchery and death, and the women and babes to destruction. And after you have read them, read the chapters of horror in the New Testament, threatening eternal fire and flame. And then read this, the greatest thought uttered by the greatest of human beings. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mighty. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. Compare that with your doctrine of the New Testament. If Jehovah was an infinite God and knew things from the beginning, he knew that his Bible would be a breastwork behind which tyranny and hypocrisy would crouch, and knew his Bible would be the auction block on which the mother would stand while her babe was sold from her, because he knew his Bible would be quoted by tyrants, that it would be quoted in defense of robbers called kings, and by hypocrites called priests. He knew that he had taught the Jewish people. He knew that he had found them free and left them slaves. He knew that he had broken every single promise made to them. He knew that while other nations advanced in knowledge, in art, in science, his chosen people were subjects still. He promised them the world. He gave them a desert. He promised them liberty and made them slaves. He promised them power. He gave them exile, and anyone who reads the Old Testament is compelled to say that nothing could add to their misery. Let us be honest. How do you account for this religion, this world? Where did it come from? You hear every minister say that man is a religious animal, that religion is natural. While man is an ignorant animal, man will be a theological animal, and no longer. Where did we get this religion? The savage knew but little of nature, but thought that everything happened in reference to him. He thought his sins caused earthquakes, and that his virtues made the sunshine. Nothing is so egotistical as ignorance. You know, and so do I, that if no human being existed, the sun would shine, and that tempests would now and then devastate the earth. Violets would spread their velvet bosoms to the sun, daisies would grow, roses would fill the air with perfume, and now and then volcanoes would illuminate the horizon with their lurid glare. The grass would grow, the waters would run, and so far as nature is concerned, everything would be as joyous as though the earth were filled with happy homes. We know the barbarian savage thinks that all this was on his account. He thinks that there dwelt two very powerful deities, that there was a good one because he knows good things happen to him, and that there was a bad one because he knows bad things happen to him. Behind the evil influence he puts a devil, and behind the good an intention of God. And then he imagines both these beings are in opposition, and that between them they struggle for the possession of his ignorant soul. He also thinks that the place where the good deity lives is heaven, and that the place where the other deity keeps himself is a place of torture and punishment. And about that time other barbarians have chosen to keep the ignorant ones in subjection by means of the doctrine of fear and punishment. There is no reforming power in fear. You can scare a man, maybe, so bad that he won't do a thing, but you can't scare him so bad he won't want to do it. There is no reforming power in punishment or brute force. But our barbarians rather imagine that every being would punish in accordance with his power and his dignity, and that God would subject them to torture in the same way as those who made him angry. They knew the king would inflict torments upon one in his power, and they supposed that God would inflict torture according to his power. They knew the worst torture was a slow burning fire. Added to it the idea of eternity, and hell was produced. That was their idea. All meanness, revenge, selfishness, cruelty, and hatred of which men here are capable burst into blossom and bore fruit in that one word, hell. In this way, a God of infinite wisdom experimented with man, keeping him between an outstretched abyss beneath and a heaven above. And in time the man came to believe that he could please God by having read a few sacred books, could count beads, could sprinkle water, eat little square pieces of bread, and that he could shut his eyes and say words to the clouds. But the moment he left this world nothing remained except to damn him. He was to be kept miserable one day in 7, and he could slander and persecute other men all the other days in the week. That was the chance that God gave a man here. But the moment he left this world, that settled it. He would go to eternal pain or else to eternal joy. That was the way that the supernatural governed this world. Through fear, through terror, through eternity of punishment. And that government, I say tonight, has failed. How has it been kept alive so long? It was born in ignorance. Let me tell you, whoever attacks a creed will be confronted with a list of great men who have believed in it. Probably their belief in that creed was the only weakness they had. But he will be asked, so you know more than all the great men who have taught, and all the respectable men who have believed in that faith. For the church is always going about to get a certificate from some governor, or even perhaps members of the legislature, and you are told because so and so believed all these things, and you have no more talents than they, that you should believe the same thing. But I contend as against this argument that you should not take the testimony of these men unless you are willing to take at the same time all their beliefs on other subjects. Then again, they tell you that the rich people are all on their side, and I say so too. The churches today seek the rich, and poverty unwillingly seeks them. Light thrown from diamonds adorns the repentant here. We are told that the rich, the fortunate, and the holders of place are Christians now. And yet ministers grow eloquent over the poverty of Christ, who was born in a manger, and say that the Holy Ghost passed the titled ladies of the world and selected the wife of a poor mechanic for the mother of God. Such is the difference between theory and practice. The church condemns the men of Jerusalem who held positions and who held the pretensions of the Savior in contempt. They admit that he was so little known that they had to bribe a man to point him out to the soldiers. They assert that he performed miracles, yet he remained absolutely unknown, hidden in the depth of obscurity. No one knew him, and one of his disciples had to be bribed to point him out. Surely he and his disciples could have met the arguments which were urged against their religion at that time. So long as the church honored philosophers, she kept her great men in the majority. How is it now? I say tonight that no man of genius in the world is in the orthodox pulpit, so far as I know. Where are they? Where are the orthodox great men? I challenge the Christian church to produce a man like Alexander Humboldt. I challenge the world to produce a naturalist like Hegel. I challenge the Christian world to produce a man like Darwin. Where in the ranks of orthodoxy are historians like Draper and Buckle? Where are the naturalists like Tyndall, philosophers like Mills and Spencer, and women like George Eliot and Harriet Martineau? You may get tired of the great men argument, but the names of the great thinkers and naturalists and scientists of our time cannot be matched by the supernatural world. What is the next argument they will bring forward? The father and mother argument. You must not disgrace your parents. How did Christ come to leave the religion of his mother? That argument proves too much. There is one way every man can honor his mother. That is by finding out more than she knew. There is one way a man can honor his father, by correcting the old man's errors. Most people imagine that the creed we have came from the brain and heart of Christ. They have no idea how it was made. They think it was all made at one time. They don't understand that it was a slow growth. They don't understand that theology is a science made up of mistakes, prejudices, and falsehoods. Let me tell you a few facts. The Emperor Constantine, who lifted the Christian religion into power, murdered his wife and his eldest son the very year that he convened the Council of Nice to decide whether Jesus Christ was man or God. And that was not decided until the year of grace 325. Then Theodosius called a council at Constantinople in 381, and this council decided that the Holy Ghost proceeded from the Father. You see, there was a little doubt on that question before this was done. Then another council was called later to determine who the Virgin Mary really was, and it was solemnly decided that she was the mother of Christ. In 431, and then in 451, a council was held in Chalcedon by the Emperor Marcian, and that decided that Christ had two natures, a human and a divine. In 680 another council was held at Constantinople, and in 1274 at Lyons it was decided that the Holy Ghost proceeded not only from the Father, but from the Son. And when you take into consideration the fact that a belief in the Trinity is absolutely essential to salvation, you see how important it was that these doctrines should have been established in 1274, when millions of people had dropped into hell in the interim, solely because they had forgotten that question. At last we know how religions are made. We know how miracles are manufactured. We know the history of relics and bones and pieces of the true cross. And at last we understand apostolic succession. At last we have examined other religions, and we find them all the same. And we are beginning to suspect that ours is like the rest. I think we understand it. I read a little story a short time ago from the Japanese that throws light upon the question. There was an old priest at a monastery. This monastery was built over the bones of what he called a saint, and people came there and were cured of many diseases. This priest had an assistant. After the assistant grew up and got quite to understand his business, the old priest gave him a little donkey, and told him that henceforth he was to take care of himself. The young priest started out with his little donkey, and asked alms of those he met. Few gave to him. Finally he got very poor. He could not raise money enough to feed the donkey. Finally the donkey died. He was about to bury it when a thought occurred to him. He buried the donkey and sat down on the grave, and to the next stranger that passed he said, "Will you not give a little money to erect a shrine over the bones of a sinless one?" Thereupon a man gave money. Others followed his example. A shrine was raised, and in a little while a monastery was built over the bones of the sinless one. Down in the grave the young priest made an orifice, so that persons afflicted with any disease could reach down and touch the bones of the sinless one. Hundreds were thus cured, and persons left their crutches as testimonials to the miraculous power of the bones of the sinless one. Finally the priest became so rich that he thought he would visit his old master. He went to the old monastery with a fine retinue. His old master asked him how he became so rich and prosperous. He replied, "Old age is stupid, but youth has thought." Later on he explained to the old priest how the donkey had died, and how he had raised a monastery over the bones of the sinless one, and again reminded him that old age is stupid, but youth has thought. The old priest exclaimed, "Not quite so fast, young man, not quite so fast. Don't imagine you worked out anything new. This shrine of mine is built over the bones of the mother of your little donkey." We have now reached a point in the history of the world when we know that theocracy as a form of government is a failure, and we see that theology as a foundation of government is an absolute failure. We can see that theocracy and theology created not liberty, but despotism. We know enough of the history of the churches in this world to know that they never can civilize mankind, that they are not imbued with the spirit of progress, that they are not imbued with the spirit of justice and mercy. What I ask you tonight is, what has the church done to civilize mankind? What has the church done for us? How has it added to the prosperity of this world? Has it ever produced anything? Nothing. Why, they say it has been charitable. How can a beggar be charitable? A beggar produces nothing. The church has been an eternal and everlasting pauper. It is not charitable. It is an object of charity, and yet it claims to be charitable. The giver is the charitable one, somebody who has made something, somebody who has by his labor produced something. He alone can be charitable. And let me say another thing. The church is always on the wrong side. Let us take first the Episcopal Church, if you call that a church. Let me tell you one thing about that church. You know what is called the rebellion in England in 1688? Do you know what caused it? I will tell you. King James was a Catholic, and notwithstanding that fact, he issued an edict of toleration for the dissenters and Catholics. And what next did he do? He ordered all the bishops to have this edict of toleration read in the Episcopal churches. They refused to do it, most of them. You recollect that trial of the 7 bishops? That is what it was all about. They would not read the edict of toleration. Then what happened? A strange thing to say, and it is one of the miracles of this world. The dissenters, in whose favor that edict was issued, joined hands with the Episcopalians and raised the rebellion against the king, because he wanted to give the dissenters liberty, and these dissenters and these Episcopalians, on account of toleration, drove King James into exile. This is the history of the first rebellion the Church of England ever raised against the king, simply because he issued an edict of toleration, and the poor miserable wretches in whose favor the edict was issued joined hands with their oppressors. I want to show you how much the Church of England has done for England. I get it from good authority. Let me read it to you to show how little influence the Christian Church, the Church of England, had with the government of that country. Let me tell you that up to the reign of George I, there were in that country 67 offenses punishable with death. There is not a lawyer in this city who can think of those offenses and write them down in one day. Think of it, 67 offenses punishable with death. Now, between the accession of George I and the termination of the reign of George III, there were added 159 new crimes punishable with death, making in all 223 crimes in England punishable with death. There is no lawyer in this state who can think of that many crimes in a week. Now, during all those years, the government was becoming more and more cruel, more and more barbarous, and we do not find, and we have not found, that the Church of England, with its 15,000 or 20,000 ministers, with its more than a score of bishops in the House of Lords, has ever raised its voice or perfected any organization in favor of a more merciful code, or in condemnation of the enormous cruelty which the laws were continually inflicting. And was not Voltaire justified in saying that the English were a people who murdered by law? Now, that is an extract from a speech made by John Bright in May, 1883. That shows what the Church of England did. 223 offenses in England, punishable with death, and no minister, no bishop, no church organization raising his or its voice against the monstrous cruelty. And why? Even then, it was better than the law of Jehovah. And the Protestants were as bad as the Catholics. You remember the time of Henry IV in France, when the Edict of Nantes was issued simply to give the Protestants the right to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. Just as soon as that edict was issued, the Protestants themselves, in the cities where they had power, prevented the Catholics from worshiping their God according to the dictates of their conscience. And it was on account of the refusal of those Protestants to allow the Catholics to worship God as they desired, that there was a civil war lasting for 7 years in France. Richelieu came into authority about the second or third year of that war. He made no difference between Protestants and Catholics, and it was owing to Richelieu that the 30 Years' War terminated. It was owing to Richelieu that the Peace of Westphalia was made in 1643, although I believe he had been dead a year before that time. But it was owing to him, and it was the first peace ever made between nations on a secular basis, with everything religious left out. And it was the last great religious war. You may ask me what I want. Well, in the first place, I want to get theology out of government. It has no business there. Man gets his authority from man, and is responsible only to man. I want to get theology out of politics. Our ancestors in 1776 retired God from politics because of the jealousies among the churches, and the result has been splendid for mankind. I want to get theology out of education. Teach the children what somebody knows, not what somebody guesses. I want to get theology out of morality and out of charity. Don't give for God's sake, but for man's sake. I want you to know another thing, that neither Protestants nor Catholics are fit to govern this world. They are not fit to govern themselves. How could you elect a minister of any religion president of the United States? Could you elect a bishop of the Catholic Church, or a Methodist bishop, or Episcopal minister, or one of the elders? No. And why? We are afraid of the ecclesiastic spirit. We are afraid to trust the liberties of men in the hands of people who acknowledge that they are bound by a standard different from that of the welfare of mankind. The history of Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Cuba, and Brazil all show that slavery existed where Catholicism was a power. I would suggest an education that would rule theology out of the government, and teach people to rely more on themselves and less on providence. There are two ways of living: the broad way of life, lived for others, and the narrow, theological way. It is wise to so live that death can be serenely faced. And then, if there is another world, the best way to prepare for it is to make the best of this. And if there be no other world, the best way to live here is to so live as to be happy and make everybody else happy. End Ingersoll's lecture on Which Way. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Ingersoll's lecture on Which Way, from the book Lectures of Colonel R.G. Ingersoll, read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during June 2007. Ingersoll's lecture on the Great Infidels. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ingersoll's lecture on the Great Infidels, from the book Lectures of Colonel Robert Green Ingersoll. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing grander in this world than to rescue from the leprosy of slander a great and splendid name. There is nothing nobler than to benefit our benefactors. The infidels of one age have been the aureole saints of the next. The destroyers of the old have always been the creators of the new. The old passes away and the new becomes old. There is, in the intellectual world as in the material, decay and growth. And even by the sunken grave of age stand youth and joy. The history of progress is written in the lives of infidels. Political rights have been preserved by traitors, intellectual rights by infidels. To attack the kings was treason, to dispute the priests, blasphemy. The sword and cross have always been allies. They defended each other. The throne and altar are twins, vultures born of the same egg. It was James I who said, "No king, no bishop, no church, no crown, no tyrant in heaven, no tyrant on earth." Every monarchy that has disgraced the world, every despotism that has covered the cheeks of men with fear, has been copied after the supposed despotism of hell. The king owned the bodies and the priest owned the souls. One lived on taxes and the other on alms. One was a robber and the other a beggar. The history of the world will not show you one charitable beggar. He who lives on charity never has anything to give away. The robbers and beggars controlled not only this world, but the next. The king made laws, the priest made creeds. With bowed backs the people received and bore the burdens of the one, and with the open mouth of wonder the creed of the other. If any aspired to be free, they were crushed by the king, and every priest was a hero who slaughtered the children of the brave. The king ruled by force, the priest by fear and by the Bible. The king said to the people, "God made you peasants and me a king. He clothed you in rags and housed you in hovels. Upon me he put robes and gave me a palace." Such is the justice of God. The priest said to the people, "God made you ignorant and vile, me holy and wise. Obey me, or God will punish you here and hereafter." Such is the mercy of God. Infidels are the intellectual discoverers. Infidels have sailed the unknown sea and have discovered the isles and continents in the vast realms of thought. What would the world have been had infidels never existed? What the infidel is in religion, the inventor is in mechanics. What the infidel is in religion, the man willing to fight the hosts of tyranny is in the political world. An infidel is a gentleman who has discovered a fact and is not afraid to tell about it. There has been for many thousands of years an idea prevalent that in some way you can prove whether the theories defended or advanced by a man are right or wrong by showing what kind of a man he was, what kind of a life he lived, and what manner of death he died. There is nothing to this. It makes no difference what the character of the man was who made the first multiplication table. It is absolutely true, and whenever you find an absolute fact, it makes no difference who discovered it. The golden rule would have been just as good if it had been first whispered by the devil. It is good for what it contains, not because a certain man said it. Gold is just as good in the hands of crime as in the hands of virtue. Whatever it may be, it is gold. A statement made by a great man is not necessarily true. A man entertains certain opinions, and then he is proscribed because he refuses to change his mind. He is burned to ashes, and in the midst of the flames he cries out that he is of the same opinion still. Hundreds then say that he has sealed his testimony with his blood, and that his doctrines must be true. All the martyrs in the history of the world are not sufficient to establish the correctness of any one opinion. Martyrdom, as a rule, establishes the sincerity of the martyr, not the correctness of his thought. Things are true or false independently of the man who entertains them. Truth cannot be affected by opinion. An error cannot be believed sincerely enough to make it the truth. No Christian will admit that any amount of heroism displayed by a Mormon is sufficient to show that Joseph Smith was an inspired prophet. All the courage and culture, all the poetry and art of ancient Greece do not even tend to establish the truth of any myth. The testimony of the dying concerning some other world, or in regard to the supernatural, cannot be any better than that of the living. In the early days of Christian experience, an intrepid faith was regarded as a testimony in favor of the church. No doubt, in the arms of death, many a one went back and died in the lay of the old faith. After a while, Christians got to dying and clinging to their faith. And then it was that Christians began to say, no man can die serenely without clinging to the cross. According to the theologians, God has always punished the dying who did not happen to believe in him. As long as men did nothing except to render their fellow men wretched, God maintained the strictest neutrality. But when some honest man expressed a doubt as to the Jewish scriptures, or prayed to the wrong God, or to the right God by the wrong man, then the real God leaped like a wounded tiger upon this dying man, and from his body tore his wretched soul. There is no recorded instance where the uplifted hand of murder has been paralyzed, or the innocent have been shielded by God. Thousands of crimes are committed every day, and God has no time to prevent them. He is too busy numbering hairs and matching sparrows. He is listening for blasphemy. He is looking for persons who laugh at priests. He is examining baptismal registers. He is watching professors in colleges who begin to doubt the geology of Moses or the astronomy of Joshua. All kinds of criminals, except infidels, meet death with reasonable serenity. As a rule, there is nothing in the death of a pirate to cast discredit upon his profession. The murderer upon the scaffold smilingly exhorts the multitude to meet him in heaven. The Emperor Constantine, who lifted Christianity into power, murdered his wife and oldest son. Now and then in the history of the world there has been a man of genius, a man of intellectual honesty. These men have denounced the superstition of their day. They were honest enough to tell their thoughts. Some of them died naturally in their beds, but it would not do for the church to admit that they had died peaceably. That would show that religion was not necessary in the last moments. The first grave, the first cathedral, the first corpse was the first priest. If there was no death in the world, there would be no superstition. The church has taken great pains to show that the last moments of all infidels have been infinitely wretched. Upon this point Catholics and Protestants have always stood together. They are no longer men. They become hyenas. They dig open graves. They devour the dead. It is an auto da fe presided over by God and his angels. These men believed in the accountability of men in the practice of virtue and justice. They believed in liberty, but they did not believe in the inspiration of the Bible. That was their crime. In order to show that infidels died overwhelmed with remorse and fear, they have generally selected from all the infidels since the days of Christ until now 5 men: the Emperor Julian, Bruno, Diderot, David Hume, and Thomas Paine. They forget that Christ himself was not a Christian, that he did what he could to tear down the religion of his day, that he held the temple in contempt. I like him because he held the old Jewish religion in contempt, because he had sense enough to say that doctrine was not true. In vain have their calumniators been called upon to prove their statements. They simply charge it, they simply relate it, but that is no evidence. The Emperor Julian did what he could to prevent Christians destroying each other. He held pomp and pride in contempt. In battle with the Persians he was mortally wounded. Feeling that he had but a short time to live, he spent his last hours in discussing with his friends the immortality of the soul. He declared that he was satisfied with his conduct, and that he had no remorse to express for any act he had ever done. The first great infidel was Giordano Bruno. He was born in the year of grace 1550. He was a Dominican friar, a Catholic, and afterwards he changed his mind. The reason he changed was because he had a mind. He was a lover of nature, and said to the poor hermits in their caves, to the poor monks in their monasteries, to the poor nuns in their cells, "Come out in the glad fields, come and breathe the fresh, free air, come and enjoy all the beauty there is in the world. There is no God who can be made happier by you being miserable. There is no God who delights to see upon the human face the tears of pain, of grief, of agony. Come out and enjoy all there is of human life. Enjoy progress, enjoy thought, enjoy being somebody and belonging to yourself." He revolted at the idea of transubstantiation. He revolted at the idea that the eternal God could be in a wafer. He revolted at the idea that you could make the Trinity out of dough, bake God in an oven as you would a biscuit. I should think he would have revolted. The idea of a man devouring the creator of the universe by swallowing a piece of bread. And yet that is just as sensible as any of it. Those who, when smitten on one cheek, turn the other, threatened to kill this man. He fled from his native land and was a vagabond in nearly every nation of Europe. He declared that he fought not what men really believed, but what they pretended to believe. And do you know, that is the business I am in. I am simply saying what other people think. I am furnishing clothes for their children. I am putting on exhibition their offspring, and they like to hear it. They like to see it. We have passed midnight in the history of the world. Bruno was driven from his native country because he taught the rotation of the earth. You can see what a dangerous man he must have been in a well regulated monarchy. You see, he had found a fact, and a fact has the same effect upon religion that dynamite has upon a Russian czar. A fellow with a new fact was suspected and arrested, and they always thought they could destroy it by burning him, but they never did. All the fires of martyrdom never destroyed one truth. All the churches of the world have never made one lie true. Germany and France would not tolerate Bruno. According to the Christian system, this world was the center of everything. The stars were made out of what little God happened to have left when he got the world done. God lived up in the sky, and they said this earth must rest upon something. And finally science passed its hand clear under, and there was nothing. It was self-existent in infinite space. Then the church began to say they didn't say it was flat, not so awful flat, it was kind of rounding. According to the ancient Christians, God lived from all eternity and never worked but 6 days in his whole life, and then had the impudence to tell us to be industrious. I heard of a man going to California over the plains, and there was a clergyman on board, and he had a great deal to say, and finally he fell in conversation with the 49er, and the latter said to the clergyman, "Do you believe that God made this world in 6 days?" "Yes, I do." They were then going along the Humboldt. Says he, "Don't you think he could put in another day to advantage right around here?" Bruno went to England and delivered lectures at Oxford. He found that there was nothing taught there but superstition, and so called Oxford the wisdom of learning. Then they told him they didn't want him any more. He went back to Italy, where there was a kind of fascination that threw him back to the very doors of the Inquisition. He was arrested for teaching that there were other worlds, and that stars are suns around which revolve other planets. He was in prison for 6 years. During those 6 years Galileo was teaching mathematics. 6 years in a dungeon. And then he was tried, denounced by the Inquisition, excommunicated, condemned by brute force, pushed upon his knees while he received the benediction of the church, and on the 16th of February, in the year of our Lord 1600, he was burned at the stake. He believed that the world is animated by an intelligent soul, the cause of force but not of matter; that matter and force have existed from eternity; that this force lives in all things, even in such as appear not to live, in the rock as much as in the man; that matter is the mother of forms and the grace of forms; that the matter and force together constitute God. He was a pantheist, that is to say, he was an atheist. He had the courage to die for what he believed to be right. The murder of Bruno will never, in my judgment, be completely and perfectly revenged until from the city of Rome shall be swept every vestige of priests and pope; until from the shapeless ruins of St. Peter's, the crumbled Vatican, and the fallen cross of Rome, rises a monument sacred to the philosopher, the benefactor, and the martyr, Bruno. Voltaire was born in 1694. When he was born the natural was about the only thing that the church did not believe in. Monks sold amulets, and the priests cured in the name of the church. The worship of the devil was actually established, which today is the religion of China. They say, God is good, he won't bother you, Joss is the one. They offer him gifts, and try and soften his heart. So in the Middle Ages the poor people tried to see if they could not get a short cut and trade directly with the devil, instead of going round about through the church. In these days witnesses were cross-examined with instruments of torture. Voltaire did more for human liberty than any other man who ever lived or died. He appealed to the common sense of mankind. He held up the great contradictions of the sacred scriptures in a way that no man, once having read him, could forget. For one, I thank Voltaire for the liberty I am enjoying this moment. How small a man a priest looked when he pointed his finger at him; how contemptible a king. Toward the last of May, 1778, it was whispered in Paris that Voltaire was dying. He expired with the most perfect tranquility. There have been constructed most shameless lies about the death of this great and wonderful man, compared with whom all his calumniators, living or dead, were but dust and vermin. From his throne at the foot of the Alps, he pointed the finger of scorn at every hypocrite in Europe. He was the pioneer of his century. In 1771, in Scotland, David Hume was born. Scotch Presbyterianism is the worst form of religion that has ever been produced. The Scotch Kirk had all the faults of the Church of Rome without a redeeming feature. The Church hated music, despised painting, abhorred statuary, and held architecture in contempt. Anything touched with humanity, with the weakness of love, with the dimple of joy, was detested by the Scotch Kirk. God was to be feared. God was infinitely practical. No nonsense about God. They used to preach 4 times a day. They preached on Friday before the Sunday upon which they partook of the sacrament, and then on Saturday, 4 sermons on Sunday, and 2 or 3 on Monday to sober up on. They were bigoted and heartless. One case will illustrate. In the beginning of this 19th century, a boy 17 years of age was indicted at Edinburgh for blasphemy. He had given it as his opinion that Moses had learned magic in Egypt, and had fooled the Jews. They proved that on 2 or 3 occasions, when he was real cold, he jocularly remarked that he wished he was in hell so that he could warm up. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to be hanged. He recanted. He even wrote that he believed the whole business, and that he just said it for pure devilment. It made no difference. They hung him, and his bruised and bleeding corpse was denied to his own mother, who came and besought them to let her take her boy home. That was Scotch Presbyterianism. If the devil had been let loose in Scotland, he would have improved that country at that time. David Hume was one of the few Scotchmen who was not owned by the church. He had the courage to examine things for himself, and to give his conclusion to the world. His life was unstained by an unjust act. He did not, like Abraham, turn a woman from his door with his child in her arms. He did not, like King David, murder a man that he might steal his wife. He didn't believe in Scotch Presbyterianism. I don't see how any good man ever did. Just think of going to the day of judgment, if there is one, and standing up before God and admitting without a blush that you have lived and died a Scotch Presbyterian. I would expect the next sentence would be, "Depart, ye cursed, in everlasting fire." Hume took the ground that a miracle could not be used as evidence until you had proved the miracle. Of course, that excited the church. Why? Because they could not prove one of them. How are you going to prove a miracle? Who saw it? And who would know a devil if he did see him? Hume insisted that at the bottom of all good is something useful; that after all, human happiness was the great object, end, and aim of life; that virtue was not a termagant, with sunken cheeks and frightful eyes, but was the most beautiful thing in the world, and would strew your path with flowers from the cradle to the grave. When he died they gave an account of how he had suffered. They knew that the horrors of death would fall upon him, and that God would get his revenge. But his attending physician said that his death was the most serene and most perfectly tranquil of any he had ever seen. Adam Smith said he was as near perfect as the frailty incident to humanity would allow human being to be. The next is Benedict Spinoza, a Jew, born in Amsterdam in 1768. He studied theology, and asked the rabbis too many questions, and talked too much about what he called reason. And finally he was excommunicated from the synagogue and became an outcast at the age of 24, without friends. Cursed, anathematized, bearing upon his forehead the mark of Cain, he undertook to solve the problem of the universe. To him the universe was one. The infinite embraced the all. That all was God. He was right. The universe is all there is, and if God does not exist in the universe, he exists nowhere. The idea of putting some little Jewish Jehovah outside the universe, as if to say that from an eternity of idleness he woke up one morning and thought he would make something. The propositions of Spinoza are as luminous as the stars, and his demonstrations, each one of them, is a Gibraltar behind which logic sits laughing at all the sophistries of theological thought. In every relation of life he was just, true, gentle, patient, loving, affectionate. He died in 1812. In his life of 44 years he had climbed to the very highest alpine of human thought. He was a great and splendid man, an intellectual hero, one of the benefactors, one of the titans of our race. And now I will say a few words about our infidels. We had three, to say the least of them: Paine, Franklin, and Jefferson. In their day the colonies were filled with superstition, and the Puritans with the spirit of persecution. Law, savage, ignorant, and malignant, had been passed in every colony for the purpose of destroying intellectual liberty. Manly freedom was unknown. The Toleration Act of Maryland tolerated only chickens, not thinkers, not investigators. It tolerated faith, not brains. The charity of Roger Williams was not extended to one who denied the Bible. Let me show you how we have advanced. Suppose you took every man and woman out of the penitentiary in New England and shipped them to a new country where man before had never trod, and told them to make a government, and constitution, and a code of laws for themselves. I say tonight that they would make a better constitution and a better code of laws than any that were made in any of the original 13 colonies of the United States. Not that they are better men, not that they are more honest, but that they have got more sense. They have been touched with the dawn of the eternal day of liberty that will finally come to this world. They would have more respect for others' rights than they had at that time. But the churches were jealous of each other, and we got a constitution without religion in it from the mutual jealousies of the church, and from the genius of men like Paine, Franklin, and Jefferson. We are indebted to them for a constitution without a God in it. They knew that if you put God in there, an infinite God, there wouldn't be any room for the people. Our fathers retired Jehovah from politics. Our fathers, under the directions and leadership of those infidels, said, all power comes from the consent of the governed. George Washington wanted to establish a church by law in Virginia. Thomas Jefferson prevented it. Under the guarantee of liberty of conscience which was given, our legislation has improved, and it will not be many years before all laws touching liberty of conscience, except it may be in the state of Delaware, will be blotted out, and when that time comes we or our children may thank the infidels of 1776. The church never pretended that Franklin died in fear. Franklin wrote no books against the Bible. He thought it useless to cast the pearls of thought before the swine of his generation. Jefferson was a statesman. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of a university, father of a political body, president of the United States, a statesman, and a philosopher. He was too powerful for the churches of his day. Paine attacked the Trinity and the Bible both. He had done these things openly. His arguments were so good that his reputation got bad. I want you to recollect tonight that he was the first man who wrote these words: "The United States of America." I want you to know tonight that he was the first man who suggested the Federal Constitution. I want you to know that he did more for the actual separation from Great Britain than any man that ever lived. I want you to know that he did as much for liberty with his pen as any soldier did with his sword. I want you to know that during the Revolution his crisis was the pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. I want you to know that his common sense was the one star in the horizon of despotism. I want you to know that he did as much as any living man to give our free flag to the free air. He was not content to waste all his energies here. When the volcano covered Europe with the shreds of robes and broken fragments of thrones, Paine went to France. He was elected by 4 constituencies. He had the courage to vote against the death of Louis, and was imprisoned. He wrote to Washington, the president, and asked him to interfere. Washington threw the letter in the waste basket of forgetfulness. When Paine was finally released, he gave his opinion of George Washington, and under such circumstances I say a man can be pardoned for having said even unjust things. The 18th century was crowning its gray hairs with the wreaths of progress, and Thomas Paine said, "I will do something to liberate mankind from superstition." He wrote the Age of Reason. For his good he wrote it too soon. For ours not a day too quick. From that moment he was a despised and calumniated man. When he came back to this country he could not safely walk the streets for fear of being mobbed. Under the Constitution he had suggested, his rights were not safe. Under the flag that he had helped give to heaven, with which he had enriched the air, his liberty was not safe. Is it not a disgrace to us that all the lies that have been told about him, and will be told about him, are a perpetual disgrace? I tell you that upon the grave of Thomas Paine the churches of America have sacrificed their reputation for veracity. Who can hate a man with a creed? I believe in one God, and no more, and I hope for immortality. I believe in the equality of man, and that religious duty consists in doing justice, in doing mercy, and in endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy. It is necessary to the happiness of man that he be faithful to himself. One good schoolmaster is worth 1,000 priests. Man has no property in man, and the key of heaven is in the keeping of no saint. Grand, splendid, brave man, with some faults, with many virtues. The world is better because he lived, and if Thomas Paine had not lived, I could not have delivered this lecture here tonight. Did all the priests of Rome increase the mental wealth of man as much as Bruno? Did all the priests of France do as great a work for the civilization of this world as Diderot and Voltaire? Did all the ministers of Scotland add as much to the sum of human knowledge as David Hume? Have all the clergymen, monks, friars, ministers, priests, bishops, cardinals, and popes, from the day of Pentecost to the last election, done as much for human liberty as Thomas Paine? What would the world be now if infidels had never been? Infidels have been the flower of all this world. Recollect, by infidels I mean every man who has made an intellectual advance. By orthodox I mean a gentleman who is petrified in his mind, whopping around intellectually, simply to save the funeral expenses of his soul. Infidels are the creditors of all the years to come. They have made this world fit to live in, and without them the human brain would be as empty as the chronicles soon will be. Unless they preach something that the people want to hear, it is not a crime to benefit our fellow man intellectually. The churches point to their decayed saints and their crumbled popes and say, "Do you know more than all the ministers that ever lived?" And without the slightest egotism or blush I say, "Yes, and the name of Humboldt outweighs them all." The men who stand in the front rank, the men who know most of the secrets of nature, the men who know most, are today the advanced infidels of this world. I have lived long enough to see the brand of intellectual inferiority on every orthodox brain. End of Ingersoll's lecture on the Great Infidels. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Ingersoll's lecture on the Great Infidels from the book Lectures of Colonel Robert Green Ingersoll, read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during June 2007. Lecture on Talmagian Theology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ingersoll's lecture on Talmagian Theology from the book Lectures of Colonel R.G. Ingersoll. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing can be more certain than that no human being can by any possibility control his thought. We are in this world. We see, we hear, we feel, we taste, and everything in nature makes an impression upon the brain. And that wonderful something enthroned there with these materials weaves what we call thought, and the brain can no more help thinking than the heart can help beating. The blood pursues its old accustomed round without our will. The heart beats without asking leave of us, and the brain thinks in spite of all that we can do. This being true, no human being can justly be held responsible for his thought any more than for the beating of his heart, any more than for the course pursued by the blood, any more than for breathing air. And yet, for thousands of years, thought has been thought to be a crime, and thousands and millions have threatened us with eternal fire if we give the product of that brain. Each brain, in my judgment, is a field where nature sows the seeds of thought, and thought is the crop that man reaps, and it certainly cannot be a crime to gather. It certainly cannot be a crime to tell it, which simply amounts to the right to sell your crop or to exchange your product for the product of some other man's brain. That is all it is. Most brains, at least some, are rather poor fields, and the orthodox worst of all. That field produces mostly sorrel and mullein, while there are fields which, like the tropic world, are filled with growth, and where you find the vine and palm, royal children of the sun and brain. I then stand simply for absolute freedom of thought. Absolute! And I don't believe, if there be a God, that it will be or can be pleasing to him to see one of his children afraid to express what he thinks. And if I were God, I never would cease making men until I succeeded in making one grand enough to tell his honest opinion. Now, there has been a struggle, you know, a long time, between the believers in the natural and the supernatural, between gentlemen who are going to reward us in another world, and those who propose to make life worth living here and now. In all ages the priest, the medicine man, the magician, the astrologer, in other words, gentlemen who have traded upon the fear and ignorance of their fellow man in all countries, they have sought to make their living out of others. There was a time when a god presided over every department of human interest, when a man about to take a voyage bribed the priest of Neptune, so that he might have a safe journey, and when he came back he paid more, telling the priest that he was infinitely obliged to him, that he had kept waves from the sea and storms in their caves. And so, when one was sick, he went to a priest. When one was about to take a journey, he visited a priest of Mercury. If he were going to war, he consulted the representative of Mars. We have gone along. When the poor agriculturist plowed his ground and put in the seed, he went to the priest of some god and paid him to keep off the frost. And the priest said he would do it. But, added the priest, you must have faith. If the frost came early, he said, you didn't have faith. And besides all that, he says to him, anything that has happened badly, after all, was for your good. Well, we found out day by day that a good boat for the purpose of navigating the sea was better than prayers, better than the influence of priests. And you had better have a good captain attending to business than thousands of priests ashore praying. We also found that we could cure some diseases, and just as soon as we found that we could cure diseases, we dismissed the priest. We have left him out now of all of them, except it may be cholera and smallpox. When visited by a plague, some people get frightened enough to go back to the old idea. Go back to the priest, and the priest says, it has been sent as a punishment. Well, sensible people began to look about. They saw that the good died as readily as the bad. They saw that this disease would attack the dimpled child in the cradle, and allow the murderer to go unpunished. And so they began to think in time that it was not sent as a punishment, that it was a natural result, and so the priest stepped out of medicine. In agriculture we needed him no longer. He has nothing to do with the crops. All the clergymen in this world can never get one drop of rain out of the sky, and all the clergymen in the civilized world could not save one human life if they tried it. Oh, but they say, we do not expect a direct answer to prayer. It is the reflex action we are after. It is like a man endeavoring to lift himself up by the straps of his boots. He will never do it, but he will get a great deal of useful exercise. The missionary goes to some pagan land, and there he finds a man praying to a god of stone, and it excites the wrath of the missionary. I ask you tonight, does not that stone god answer prayer just as well as ours? Does he not cause rain? Does he not delay frost? Does he not snatch the ones that we love from the grasp of death precisely the same as ours? Yet we have ministers that are still engaged in that business. They tell us that they have been called, that they do not go at their profession as other people do, but they are called, that God, looking over the world, carefully selects his priests, his ministers, and his exhorters. I don't know. They say their calling is sacred. I say to you tonight that every kind of business that is honest, that a man engages in for the purpose of feeding his wife and children, for the purpose of building up his home, for the purpose of feeding and clothing the ones he loves, that business is sacred. They tell us that statesmen and poets, philosophers, heroes, and scientists and inventors come by chance, that all other departments depend entirely upon luck, but when God wants exhorters, he selects. They also tell us that it is infinitely wicked to attack the Christian religion. And when I speak of the Christian religion, I do not refer especially to the Christianity of the New Testament. I refer to the Christianity of the Orthodox Church. And when I refer to the clergy, I refer to the clergy of the Orthodox Church. There was a time when men of genius were in the pulpits of the Orthodox Church. That time is past. When you find a man with brains now occupying an Orthodox pulpit, you will find him touched with heresy. every one of them. How do they get most of these ministers? There will be a man in the neighborhood not very well, not having constitution enough to be wicked, and it instantly suggests itself to everybody who sees him that he would make an excellent minister. There are so many other professions, so many cities to be built, so many railways to be constructed, so many poems to be sung, so much music to be composed, so many papers to edit, so many books to read, so many splendid things, so many avenues to distinction and glory, so many things beckoning from the horizon of the future to every great and splendid man, that the pulpit has to put up with the leavings, ravelings, selvage. These preachers say, how can any man be wicked and infamous enough to attack our religion and take from the world the solace of orthodox Christianity? What is that solace? Let us be honest. What is it? If the Christian religion be true, the grandest, greatest, noblest of the world are now in hell, and the narrowest and meanest are now in heaven. Humboldt, the Shakespeare of science, the most learned man of the most learned nation, with a mind grand enough to grasp not simply this globe, but this constellation, a man who shed light upon the whole earth, a man who honored human nature, and who won all his victories on the field of thought. That man, pure and upright, noble beyond description, if Christianity be true, is in hell this moment. That is what they call solace. Tidings of great joy. Laplace, who read the heavens like an open book, who enlarged the horizon of human thought, is there too. Beethoven, master of melody and harmony, who added to the joy of human life, and who has borne upon the wings of harmony and melody millions of spirits to the height of joy, with his heart still filled with melody, he is in hell today. Robert Burns, poet of love and liberty, and from his heart, like a spring gurgling and running down the highways, his poems have filled the world with music, they have added luster to human love. The man who, in 4 lines, gave all the philosophy of life. To make a happy fireside clime for weans and wife is the true pathos and sublime of human life. He is there with the rest. Charles Dickens, whose genius will be a perpetual shield, saving thousands and millions of children from blows, who did more to make us tender with children than any other writer that ever touched a pen. He is there with the rest, according to our Christian religion. A little while ago there died in this country a philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a man of the loftiest ideal, a perfect model of integrity, whose mind was like a placid lake and reflected truths like stars. If the Christian religion be true, he is in perdition today. And yet he sowed the seeds of thought and raised the whole world intellectually. And Longfellow, whose poems tender as the dawn have gone into millions of homes, not an impure, not a stained word in them all. But he was not a Christian. He did not believe in the tidings of great joy. He didn't believe that God so loved the world that he intended to damn most everybody. And now he has gone to his reward. And Charles Darwin, a child of nature, one who knew more about his mother than any other child she ever had. What is philosophy? It is to account for phenomena by which we are surrounded. That is, to find the hidden cord that unites everything. Charles Darwin threw more light upon the problem of human existence than all the priests who ever lived, from Melchizedek to the last exhorter. He would have traversed this globe on foot had it been possible to have found one new fact, or to have corrected one error that he had made. No nobler man has lived, no man who has studied with more reverence, and by reverence I mean simply one who lives and studies for the truth. no man who studied with more reverence than he. And yet, according to the orthodox religion, Charles Darwin is in hell. Consolation. So, if Christianity be true, Shakespeare, the greatest man who ever touched this planet, within whose brain were the fruits of all thought past, the seeds of all to be, Shakespeare, who was an intellectual ocean toward which all rivers ran, and from which now the isles and continents of thought received their dew and rain, that man who has added more to the intelligence of the world than any other who ever lived, that man whose creations will live as long as man has imagination, and who has given more happiness upon the stage and more instruction than has flown from all the pulpits of this earth, that man is in hell too. And Harriet Martineau, who did as much for English liberty as any man, brave and free, she is there. George Eliot, the greatest woman the English speaking people ever produced, she is with the rest. And this is called tidings of great joy. Who are in heaven? How could there be much of a heaven without the men I have mentioned, the great men who have endeavored to make the world grander, such men as Voltaire, such men as Diderot, such men as the encyclopedists, such men as Hume, such men as Bruno, such men as Thomas Paine? If Christianity is true, that man who spent his life in breaking chains is now wearing the chains of God. That man who wished to break down the prison walls of tyranny is now in the prison of the most merciful Christ. It will not do. I can hardly express to you today my contempt for such a doctrine, and if it be true, I make my choice today, and I prefer hell. Who is in heaven? John Calvin, John Knox, Jonathan Edwards, Torquemada, the builders of dungeons, the men who have obstructed the march of the human race. These are the men who are in heaven. And who else? Those who never had brain enough to harbor a doubt. And they ask me, how can you be wicked enough to attack the Christian religion? Oh, but they say, God will never forgive you if you attack the orthodox religion. Now, when I read the history of this world, and when I think of the experience of my fellow men, when I think of the millions living in poverty, and when I know that in the very air we breathe and in the sunlight that visits our homes there lurks an assassin ready to take our lives, and even when we believe we are in the fullness of health and joy, they are undermining us with their contagion. When I know that we are surrounded by all these evils, and when I think of what man has suffered, I do not wonder if God can forgive man. But I often ask myself, can man forgive God? There is another thing. Some of these ministers have talked about me, and have made it their business to say unpleasant things. Among others, the Reverend Mr. Talmage of Brooklyn, a man of not much imagination, but of most excellent judgment, charges that I am a blasphemer. A frightful charge! Terrible if true. What is blasphemy? It is a sin, as I understand, against God. Is God infinite? He is, so they say. He is infinite, absolutely conditionless. Can I injure the conditionless? No. Can I sin against anything that I cannot injure? No. That is a perfectly plain proposition. I can injure my fellow man because he is a conditioned being, and I can help to change those conditions. He must have air, he must have food, he must have clothing, he must have shelter. But God is conditionless, and I cannot by any possibility affect him. Consequently, I cannot sin against him. But I can sin against my fellow man, so that I ought to be 1,000 times more careful of doing injustice than of uttering blasphemy. There is no blasphemy but injustice, and there is no worship except the practice of justice. It is 1,000 times more important that we should love our fellow men than that we should love God. It is better to love wife and children than to love Jesus Christ. He is dead. They are alive. I can make their lives happy, and fill all their hours with the fullness of joy. That is my religion, and the holiest temple ever erected beneath the stars is the home. The holiest altar is the fireside. What is this blasphemy? First, it is a geographical question. There was a time when it was blasphemy in Jerusalem to say that Christ was God. In this country it is now blasphemy to say that he was not. It is blasphemy in Constantinople to deny that Mohammed was the prophet of God. It is blasphemy here to say that he was. It is a geographical question. You cannot tell whether it is blasphemy or not without looking at the map. What is blasphemy? It is what the mistake says about the fact. It is what the last year's leaf says about this year's bud. It is the last cry of the defeated priest. Blasphemy is the little breastwork behind which hypocrisy hides, behind which mental impotency feels safe. There is no blasphemy but the avowal of thought, and he who speaks what he thinks blasphemes. That I have had the hardihood, it doesn't take much, to attack the sacred scriptures. I have simply given my opinion, and yet they tell me that that book is holy, that you can take rags, make pulp, put ink on it, bind it in leather, and make something holy. The Catholics have a man for a pope. The Protestants have a book. The Catholics have the best of it. If they elect an idiot, he will not live forever. And it is impossible for us to get rid of the barbarisms in our book. The Catholics said, we will not let the common people read the Bible. That was right. If it is necessary to believe it in order to get to heaven, no man should run the risk of reading it. To allow a man to read the Bible on such conditions is to set a trap for his soul. The right way is never to open it. And when you get to the day of judgment and they ask you if you believe it, say, yes, I have never read it. The Protestant gives the book to a poor man and says, read it. You are at liberty to read it. Well, suppose I don't believe it when I get through. Then you will be damned. No man should be allowed to read it on those conditions. And yet Protestants have done that infinitely cruel thing. If I thought it was necessary to believe it, I would say never read another line in it, but just believe it and stick to it. And yet these people really think that there is something miraculous about the book. They regard it as a fetish, a kind of amulet, a something charmed that will keep off evil spirits or bad luck, stop bullets, and do 1,000 handy things for the preservation of life. I heard a story upon that subject. You know that thousands of them are printed in the Sunday school book. Here is one they don't print. There was a poor man who had belonged to the church, but he got cold, and he rather neglected it, and he had bad luck in his business, and he went down and down and down until he hadn't a dollar, not a thing to eat. And his wife said to him, John, this comes of you having abandoned the church. This comes of your having done away with family worship. Now, I beg of you, let's go back. Well, John said it wouldn't do any harm to try, so he took down the Bible, blew the dust off it, read a little from a chapter, and had family worship. As he was putting it up, he opened it again, and there was a $10 bill between the leaves. He rushed out to the butcher's and bought meat, to the grocer's and bought tea and bread and butter and eggs, and rushed back home and got them cooked, and the house was filled with the perfume of food. And he sat down at the table, tears in every eye and a smile on every face. She said, "What did I tell you?" Just then there was a knock on the door, and in came a constable, who arrested him for passing a $10 counterfeit bill. They tell me that I ought not to attack the Bible. that I have misrepresented it, and among other things that I have said that, according to the Bible, the world was made of nothing. Well, what was it made of? They say God created everything, consequently there must have been nothing when he commenced. If he didn't make it of nothing, what did he make it of? Where there was nothing, he made something. Yes, out of what? I don't know. This doctor of divinity, and I should think such a divinity would need a doctor, says that God made the universe out of his omnipotence. Why not out of his omniscience or his omnipresence? Omnipotence is not a raw material. It is the something to work raw material with. Omnipotence is simply all powerful, and what good would strength do with nothing? The weakest man ever born could lift as much nothing as God, and he could do as much with it after he got it lifted. And yet a doctor of divinity tells me that this world was made of omnipotence. And right here, let me say, I find even in the mind of the clergyman the seeds of infidelity. He is trying to explain things. This is a bad symptom. The greater the miracle, the greater the reward for believing it. God cannot afford to reward a man for believing anything reasonable. Why, even the scribes and Pharisees would believe a reasonable thing. Do you suppose God is to crown you with eternal joy and give you a musical instrument for believing something where the evidence is clear? No, sir. The larger the miracle, the more grace. And let me advise the ministers of Chicago and of this country never to explain a miracle. It cannot be explained. If you succeed in explaining it, the miracle is gone. If you fail, you are gone. My advice to the clergy is, use assertion. Just say, "It is so." And the larger the miracle, the greater the glory reaped by the eternal. And yet this man is trying to explain, pretending that he had some raw material of some kind on hand. And then I objected to the fact that he didn't make the sun until the fourth day, and that consequently the grass could not have grown, could not have thrown its mantle of green over the shoulders of the hill, and that the trees would not blossom and cast their shade upon the sod without some sunshine. And what does this man say? Why, that the rocks, when they crystallized, emitted light, even enough to raise a crop by. And he says vegetation might have depended on the glare of volcanoes in the moon. What do you think would be the fate of agriculture depending on the glare of volcanoes in the moon? Then he says the aurora borealis. Why, you couldn't raise cucumbers by the aurora borealis. And he says liquid rivers of molten granite. I would like to have a farm on that stream. He guesses everything of the kind except lightning bugs and foxfire. Now think of that explanation in the last half of the 19th century by a minister. The truth is, the gentleman who wrote the account knew nothing of astronomy, knew as little as the modern preacher does, just about the same. And if they don't know more about the next world than they do about this, it is hardly worthwhile talking with them on the subject. There was a time, you know, when the minister was the educated man in the country, and when, if you wanted to know anything, you asked him. Now you do if you don't. So I find this man expounding the flood, and he says it was not very wet. He begins to doubt whether God had water enough to cover the whole earth. Why not stand by his book? He says that some of the animals got into the ark to keep out of the wet. I believe that is the way the Democrats got to the polls last Tuesday. Another divine says that God would have drowned them all, but it was purely for the sake of economy that he saved any of them. Just think of that! According to this Christian religion, all the people in the world were totally depraved through the fall, and God found He could not do anything with them, so He drowned them. Now, if God wanted to get up a flood big enough to drown sin, why did He not get up a flood big enough to drown the snake? That was His mistake. Now, these people say that if Jonah had walked rapidly up and down the whale's belly, he would have avoided the action of its gastric juice. Imagine Jonah sitting in the whale's mouth, on the back of a molar tooth. And yet this doctor of divinity would have us believe that the infinite God of the universe was sitting under His gourd and made the worm that was at the root of Jonah's vine. Great business. David is said to have been a man after God's own heart, and if you will read the 28th chapter of Chronicles, you will find that David died full of years and honors. So I find in the great book of prophecy concerning Solomon, "He shall reign in peace and quietness. He shall be my son, and I shall be his father, and I will preserve his kingdom." Was that true? It won't do. But they say God couldn't do away with slavery suddenly, nor with polygamy all at once; that He had to do it gradually; that if He had told this man you mustn't have slaves, and one man that he must have one wife, and one wife that she must have one husband, He would have lost the control over them, notwithstanding all the miraculous power. Is it not wonderful that when they did all these miracles nobody paid any attention to them? Isn't it wonderful that in Egypt, when they performed these wonders, when the waters were turned into blood, when the people were smitten with disease and covered with the horrible animals, isn't it wonderful that it had no influence on them? Do you know why all these miracles didn't affect the Egyptians? They were there at the time. Isn't it wonderful, too, that the Jews who had been brought from bondage, had followed a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, who had been miraculously fed, and for whose benefit water had leaked from the rocks and followed them up and down hill through all their journeying? Isn't it wonderful, when they had seen the earth open and their companions swallowed, when they had seen God Himself write in robes of flame from Sinai's crags, when they had seen Him talking face to face with Moses, isn't it a little wonderful that He had no more influence over them? They were there at the time, and that is the reason they didn't mind it. They were there. And yet, with all these miracles, this God could not prevent polygamy and slavery. Was there no room on the 2 tables of stone to put 2 more commandments? Better have written them on the back then. Better have left the others all off and put these 2 on. Man shall not enslave his brother. You shall not live on unpaid labor. And the one man shall have the one wife. If these 2 had been written and the other 10 left off, it would have been 1,000 times better for this world. But they say God works gradually. No hurry about it. He is not gradual about keeping Sunday, because if He met a man picking up sticks, He killed him. But in other things He is gradual. Suppose we wanted now to break certain cannibals of eating missionaries, wanted to stop them from eating them raw. Of course, we would not tell them in the first place it was wrong. That would not do. We would induce them to cook them. That would be the first step toward civilization. We would have them stew them. We would not say it is wrong to eat missionary, but it is wrong to eat missionary raw. Then, after they began stewing them, we would put in a little mutton, not enough to excite suspicion, but just a little, and so day by day we would put in a little more mutton and a little less missionary, until in about what the Bible calls the fullness of time, we would have clear mutton and no missionary. That is God's way. The next great charge against me is that I have disgraced my parents by expressing my honest thoughts. No man can disgrace his parents that way. I want my children to express their real opinions, whether they agree with mine or not. I want my children to find out more than I have found, and I would be gratified to have them discover the errors I have made. And if my father and mother were still alive, I feel and know that I am pursuing a course of which they would approve. I am true to my manhood. But think of it. Suppose the father of Dr. Talmage had been a Methodist and his mother an infidel. Then what? Would he have to disgrace them both to be a Presbyterian? The disciples of Christ, according to this doctrine, disgraced their parents. The founder of every new religion, according to this doctrine, was a disgrace to his father and mother. Now there must have been a time when a Talmage was not a Presbyterian, and the one that left something else to join that church disgraced his father and mother. Why, if this doctrine be true, do they send missionaries to other lands and ask those people to disgrace their parents? If this doctrine be true, nobody has religious liberty except foundlings, and it should be written over every foundling hospital, "Home for Religious Liberty." It won't do. What is the next thing I have said? I have taken the high ground, and I take it again today, that the Bible has only words of humiliation for woman. The Bible treats woman as the slave, the serf of man, and wherever that book is believed in thoroughly, woman is a slave. It is the infidelity in the church that gives her what liberty she has today. Oh, but, says the gentleman, think of the heroines in the Bible. How could a book be opposed to woman which has pictured such heroines? Well, that is a good argument. Let's answer it. Who are the heroines? He tells us the first is Esther. Who was she? Esther is a very peculiar book, and the story is about this. Ahasuerus was a king. His wife's name was Vashti. She didn't please him. He divorced her and advertised for another. A gentleman by the name of Mordecai had a good-looking niece, and he took her to market. Her name was Esther. I don't feel like reading the whole of the second chapter. It is sufficient to say she was selected. After a time there was a gentleman by the name of Haman, who, I should think, was in the cabinet, according to the story, and this man Mordecai began to put on considerable style because his niece was the king's wife. And he would not bow, or he would not rise, or he would not meet this gentleman with marks of distinguished consideration. So he made up his mind to have him hung. Then they got out an order to kill the Jews, and this Esther went to see the king. In those days they believed in the Bismarckian style of government. All power came from the king, not from the people. If anybody went to see this king without an invitation, and he failed to hold out his scepter to him, the person was killed just to preserve the dignity of the monarch. When Esther arrived, he held out the scepter, and thereupon she induced him to send out another order for the fellows who were to kill the Jews. And they killed 75,000 or 80,000 of them. And they came back and said, "Kill Haman and his 10 sons." And they hung the family up. That is all there is to the story. And yet this Esther is held up as a model of womanly grace and tenderness. And there is not a more infamous story in the literature of the world. The next heroine is Ruth. I admit that is a very pretty story. But Ruth was guilty of more things that would be deemed indiscreet than any girl in Brooklyn. That is all there is about Ruth. The next heroine is Hannah. And what do you suppose was the matter with her? She made a coat for her boy, that's all. I have known a woman make a whole suit. The next heroine was Abigail. She was the wife of Natal. King David had a few soldiers with him, and he called at the house of Natal and asked if he could not get food for his men. Abigail went down to give him something to eat, and she was very much struck with David. David evidently fancied her. Natal died within a week. I think he was poisoned. David and Abigail were married. If that had happened in Chicago, there would have been a coroner's jury and an inquest. But that is all there was to that. The next is Dorcas. She was in the New Testament. She was real good to the ministers. Those ladies have always stood well with the church. She was real good to the poor. She died one day, and you never hear of her again. Then there was that person that was raised from the dead. I would like to know from a person that had recently been raised from the dead where he was when he was wanted, what he was traveling about, and what he was engaged in. I cannot imagine a more interesting person than one that has just been raised from the dead. Lazarus comes from the tomb, and I think sometimes that there must be a mistake about it, because when they come to die again, thousands of people would say, "Why, he knows all about it." Would it not be noted if a man had 2 funerals? Now then, these are all the heroines, to show you how little they thought of woman in that day. In the days of the Old Testament, they did not even tell us when the mother of us all, Eve, died, nor where she is buried, nor anything about it. They do not even tell us where the mother of Christ sleeps, nor when she died. Never is she spoken of after the morning of the resurrection. He who descended from the cross went not to see her, and the Son had no word for the broken-hearted mother. The story is not true. I believe Christ was a great and good man, but he had nothing about him miraculous except the courage to tell what he thought about the religion of his day. The New Testament, in relating what occurred between Christ and his mother, mentions 3 instances. Once, when they thought he had been lost in Jerusalem, when he said to them, "Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business?" Next, at the marriage of Cana, when he said to the woman, "What have I to do with thee?" Words which he never said. And again from the cross, "Mother, behold thy son," and to the disciple, "Behold thy mother." So of Mary Magdalene. In some respects there is no character in the New Testament that so appeals to us as loving Christ, first at the sepulchre, and yet when he meets her after the resurrection, he had for her the comfort only of the chilling words, "Touch me not." I don't believe it. There were thousands of heroic women then. There are heroic women now. Think of the women who cling to fallen and disgraced husbands day by day until they reach the gutter, and who stoop down to lift them from that position and raise them up to be men once more. Every country is civilized in proportion as it honors woman. There are women in England working in mines, deformed by labor, that would become wild beasts were it not for the love they bear for home. Can you find among the women of the New Testament any women that can equal the women born of Shakespeare's brain? You can find no woman like Isabella, where reason and purity blend into perfect truth; no woman like Juliet, where passion and purity meet like red and white within the bosom of a flower; no woman like Imogen, who said, "What is it to be false?" No woman like Cordelia, that would not show her wealth of love in hope of gain; nor like Hermione, who bore the cross of shame for years; nor like Miranda, who told her love as the flower exposes its bosom to the sun; nor like Desdemona, who was so pure that she could not suspect that another could suspect her of a crime. And we are told that woman sinned first and man second; that man was made first and woman not till afterwards. The idea is that we could have gotten along without the woman well enough, but they could never have gotten along without us. I tell you that love is better than piety. Love is better than all the ceremonial worship of the world, and it is better to love something than to believe anything on this globe. So this minister, seeking a mark to throw an arrow somewhere, trying to find some little place in the armor, charges me with having disparaged Queen Victoria. That, you know, is next to blasphemy. Well, I never did anything of the kind, never said a word against her in my life, neither as wife or mother or queen, never doubted but that she is a good woman enough, and I have always admitted that her reputation was good in the neighborhood where she resides. I never had any other opinion. All I said in the world was, I was endeavoring to show that we are now to have the aristocracy of brain and heart. That is all. And I said, speaking of Louis Napoleon, he was not satisfied with simply being an emperor and having a little crown on his head, but wanted to prove that he had something in his head. So he wrote the life of Julius Caesar, and that made him a member of the French Academy. And speaking of King William, upon whose head is the divine petroleum of authority, I asked how he would like to exchange brains with Haeckel, the philosopher. Then I went over to England and said, Queen Victoria wears the garment of power given her by blind fortune, by eyeless chance. George Eliot is arrayed in robes of glory, woven in the loom of her own genius. Thereupon I am charged with disparaging a woman. And this priest, in order to get even with me, digs open the grave of George Eliot and endeavors to stain her unresisting dust. He calls her an adulteress, the vilest word in the languages of men, and he does it because she hated the Presbyterian creed, because she, according to his definition, was an atheist, because she lived without faith and died without fear, because she grandly bore the taunts and slanders of the Christian world. George Eliot carried tenderly in her heart the faults and frailties of her race. She saw the highway of eternal right through all the winding paths, where folly vainly stalks with thorn-pierced hands the fading flowers of selfish joy. And whatever you may think, or I may think, of the one mistake in all her sad and loving life, I know and feel that in the court where her conscience sat as judge, she stood acquitted, pure as light and stainless as a star. George Eliot has joined the choir invisible, whose music is the gladness of this world, and her wondrous lines, her touching poems, will be read hundreds of years after every sermon in which a priest has sought to stain her name shall have vanished utterly from human speech. How appropriate here, with some slight change, the words of Laertes at Ophelia's grave: lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violets spring. I tell thee, priest and minister, a ministering angel shall this woman be, when thou liest howling. I have no words with which to express my loathing, hatred, and condemnation of the man who will stain a noble woman's grave. The next argument in favor of the sacred scriptures is the argument of numbers, and this minister congratulates himself that the infidels could not carry a precinct or a county or a state in the United States. Well, I tell you, they can come proportionately near it, just in proportion that that part of the country is educated. The whole world doesn't move together in one life. There has to be some man to take a step forward, and the people follow. And when they get where that man was, some other Titan has taken another step, and you can see him there on the great mountain of progress. That is why the world moves. There must be pioneers, and if nobody is right except he who is with the majority, then we must turn and walk toward the setting sun. He says, we will settle this by suffrage. The Christian religion was submitted to a popular vote in Jerusalem. And what was the result? Crucify him. An infamous result, showing that you can't depend on the vote of barbarians. But I am told that there are 300 million Christians in the world. Well, what of it? There are more Buddhists, and they say, what a number of Bibles are printed, more Bibles than any other book. Does this prove anything? True, because more of them? Suppose you should find published in the New York Herald something about you, and you should go to the editor and tell him, that is a lie. And he should say, that can't be. The Herald has the largest circulation of any paper in the world. 300 millions of Christians. And here are the nations that prove the truth of Christianity. Russia, 80 million Christians. I am willing to admit it. A country without freedom of speech, without freedom of press, a country in which every mouth is a Bastille and every tongue a prisoner for life. A country in which assassins are the best men in it. They call that Christian. Girls 16 years of age, for having spoken in favor of human liberty, are now working in Siberian mines. That is a Christian country. Only a little while ago a man shot at the emperor twice. The emperor was protected by his armor. The man was convicted, and they asked him if he wished religious consolation. No. Do you believe in a God? No. If there was a God, there would be no Russia. 16 millions of Christians in Spain. Spain that never touched a shore except as a robber. Spain that took the gold and silver of the New World and used it as an engine of oppression in the Old. A country in which cruelty was worship, in which murder was prayer. A country where flourished the Inquisition. I admit Spain is a Christian country. If you don't believe it, I do. Read the history of Holland. Read the history of South America. Read the history of Mexico. A chapter of cruelty beyond the power of language to express. I admit that Spain is orthodox. If you will go there, you will find the man who robs you and asks God to forgive you. A country where infidelity hasn't made much headway, but, thank God, where there is even yet a dawn. Where there are such men as Castelar and others, who begin to see that one schoolhouse is equal to 3 cathedrals, and one teacher worth all the priests. Italy is another Christian nation, with 28 million Christians. In Italy lives the only authorized agent of God, the Pope. For hundreds of years, Italy was the beggar of the earth, and held out both hands. Gold and silver flowed from every land into her palms, and she became covered with nunneries, monasteries, and the pilgrims of the world. Italy was sacred dust. Her soil was a perpetual blessing. Her sky was an eternal smile. Italy was guilty not simply of the death of the Catholic Church, but Italy was dead and buried, and would have been in her grave still had it not been for Mazzini, Garibaldi, and Cavour. When the prophecy of Garibaldi shall be fulfilled, when the priests with spades in their hands shall dig ditches to drain the Pontine marshes, when the monasteries shall be factories, when the whirling wheels of industry shall drown the drowsy and hypocritical prayers, then and not till then will Italy be great and free. Italy is the only instance in our history, and in the history of the world, so far as we know, of the resurrection of a nation. She is the first fruits of them that sleep. Portugal is another Christian country. She made her living in the slave trade for centuries. I admit that all the blessings that country enjoyed flowed naturally from Catholicism, and we believe in the same scriptures. If you don't believe it, read the history of the persecution of the Jewish people. I admit that Germany is a Christian nation, that is, Christians are in power. When the bill was introduced for the purpose of ameliorating the condition of the Jews, Bismarck spoke against it and said Germany is a Christian nation, and therefore we cannot pass the bill. Austria is another Christian nation. If you don't believe it, read the history of Hungary, and if you still have doubts, read the history of the partition of Poland. But there is one good thing in that country. They believe in education, and education is the enemy of ecclesiasticism. Every thoroughly educated man is his own church, and his own pope, and his own priest. They tell me that the United States, our country, is Christian. I deny it. It is neither Christian nor pagan. It is human. Our fathers retired all the gods from politics. Our fathers laid down the doctrine that the right to govern comes from the consent of the governed, and not from the clouds. Our fathers knew that if they put an infinite God in the Constitution, there would be no room left for the people. Our fathers used the language of Lincoln, and they made a government for the people, by the people. This is not a Christian country. Some gentleman said, "How about Delaware?" I told him there was a man in Washington some 20 or 30 years ago who came there and said he was a revolutionary soldier and wanted a pension. He was so bent and bowed over that the wind blew his shoestrings into his eyes. They asked him how old he was, and he said 50 years. Why, good man, you can't get a pension because the war was over before you were born. You mustn't fool us. Well, said he, I'll tell you the truth. I lived 60 years in Delaware, but I never count it, and hope God won't. And these Christian nations, which have been brought forward as the witnesses of the truth of the Scriptures, owe $25 billion, which represents Christian war, Christian cannon, Christian shot, and Christian shell. The sum is so great that the imagination is dazed in its contemplation. That is the result of loving your neighbor as yourself. The next great argument brought forward by these gentlemen is the persecution of the Jews. We are told in the 19th century that God has the Jews persecuted simply for the purpose of establishing the authenticity of the Scriptures, and every Jewish home burned in Russia throws light on the gospel, and every violated Jewish maiden is another evidence that God still takes an interest in the Holy Scriptures. That is their doctrine. They are fulfilling prophecy. The Christian grasps the Jew, strips him, robs him, makes him an outcast, and then points to him as a fulfillment of prophecy. And we are today laying the foundation of future persecution. We are teaching our children the monstrous falsehood that Jews crucified God, and the nation consented. They crucified a good man. What nation has not? What race has not? Think of the number killed by the Presbyterians, by the Catholics. Every sect, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, have crucified their fellows, and every race has burned its greatest and its best. And yet we are filling the minds of children with hatred of the Jewish people. It is a poor business. Ah, but they say these people are cursed by God. I say they never had any good fortune until the Jehovah of the Bible deserted them. Whenever they have had a reasonable chance, they have been the most prosperous people in the world. I never saw one begging. I never saw one in the criminal dock. For hundreds of years they were not allowed to own any land. For hundreds of years they were not allowed to work at any trade. They were driven simply to dealing in money, and in precious stones, and things of that character, and by a kind of poetic justice they have today the control of the money of the world. I am glad to see that kings and emperors go to the offices of the Jews with their hats in their hands to have their notes discounted. And yet I am told by clergymen that all this infamy has been kept up simply to establish the truth of the gospel. I despise such doctrine. As long as the liberty of one Jew is unsafe, my liberty is not secure. Liberty for all, and not until then will the liberty of any be assured. Ah, but says this man, nobody ever died cheerfully for a lie. The Jewish people have suffered persecution for 1600 years, and they have suffered it cheerfully. If this doctrine is true, then Judaism must be true, and Christianity must be false. But martyrdom doesn't prove the truth if the martyr knows it. It simply proves the barbarity of his persecutors, and has no sincerity. That is all it proves. But you must remember that this gentleman who believes in this doctrine is a Presbyterian. And why should a Presbyterian object? After a few hundred years of burning, he expects to enjoy the eternal auto da fe of hell, an auto da fe that will be presided over by God and his angels, and they will be expected to applaud. He is a Presbyterian. And what is that? It is the worst religion of this earth. I admit that thousands and millions of Presbyterians are good people, no man ever being half so bad as his creed. I am not attacking them. I am attacking their creed. I am attacking what this religion calls tidings of great joy. And according to that, hundreds of billions and billions of years ago, our fate was irrevocably and forever fixed, and God in the secret counsels of his own inscrutable will made up his mind whom he would save and whom he would damn. When thinking of that God, I always think of the mistake of a Methodist preacher during the war. He commenced the prayer, and never did one more appropriate for the Presbyterian God or the Methodist go up. "O thou great and unscrupulous God." This Presbyterian believes that billions of years before that baby in the cradle, that little dimpled child, basking in the light of a mother's smile, was born, God had made up his mind to damn it. And when Talmage looks at one of those children who will probably be damned, he is cheerful about it. He enjoys it. That is Presbyterianism, that God made man and damned him for his own glory. If there is such a God, I hate him with every drop of my blood, and if there is a heaven, it must be where he is not. Now think of that doctrine. Only a little while ago there was a ship from Liverpool out 80 days with its rudder washed away. For 10 days nothing to eat, nothing but the bare decks and hunger. And the captain took a revolver in his hand and put it to his brain and said, "Some of us must die for the others, and it might as well be I." One of his companions grabbed the pistol and said, "Captain, wait one more day. We can live another day." And the next morning the horizon was rich with a sail, and they were saved. And yet, if Presbyterianism is true, if that man had put the bullet through his infinitely generous brain so that his comrades could have eaten of his flesh and reached their homes and felt about their necks the dimpled arms of children and the kisses of wives upon their lips, if Presbyterianism be true, God had a constable ready there to clutch that soul and thrust it down to eternal hell. Tidings of great joy. And yet this is religion. Why, if that doctrine be true, every soldier in the Revolutionary War who died not a Christian has been damned. Every one in the War of 1812 who kept our flag upon the sea, if he died not a Christian, has been damned. And every one in the Civil War who fought to keep our flag in heaven, not a Christian, and the ones who died in Andersonville and Libby, not Christians, are now in the prison of God, where the famine of Andersonville and Libby would be regarded as a joy. Orthodox Christianity. Why, we have an account in the Bible. It comes from the other world, from both countries, from heaven and from hell. Let us see what it is. Here is a rich man who dies. The only fault about him was he was rich. No other crime was charged against him. We are told that the rich man died, and when he lifted up his eyes he found no sympathy. Yet even in hell he remembered his 5 brethren and prayed that someone should be sent to them so that they should not come there. I tell you, I had rather be in hell with human sympathy than in heaven without it. The Bible is not inspired, and ministers know nothing about another world. They don't know. I am satisfied there is no world of eternal pain. If there is a world of joy, so much the better. I have never put out the faintest star of human hope that ever trembled in the night of life. There was a time when I was not. After that I was. Now I am. And it is just as probable that I will live again as it was that I could have lived before I did. Let it go. Ah, but what will life be? The world will be here. Men and women will be here. The page of history will be open. The walls of the world will be adorned with art, the niches with sculpture. Music will be here, and all there is of life and joy. And there will be homes here, and the fireside, and there will be a common hope without a common fear. Love will be here, and love is the only bow on life's dark cloud. Love was the first to dream of immortality. Love is the morning and evening star. It shines upon the child. It sheds its radiance upon the peaceful tomb. Love is the mother of beauty, the mother of melody, for music is its voice. Love is the builder of every hope, the kindler of every fire on every hearth. Love is the enchanter, the magician that changes worthless things to joy, and makes right royal kings and queens out of common clay. Love is the perfume of that wondrous flower, the heart. Without that divine passion, without that divine sway, we are less than beasts. And with it, earth is heaven, and we are gods. End of Ingersoll's lecture on Talmagian theology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. From the book Lectures of Colonel R.G. Ingersoll, read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during June 2007.